Hello, this is lecture 9 in the Gender and Sexuality module, narrated again whilst we're off on quarantine. And this week we're going to look at issues of gender and sexuality to some extent in education, which is why we're also going to be talking about the film Educating Rita, which is all to do with a working class woman finding a university education, so it blends in issues of class with issues of gender. Hopefully you will all have had a chance to see the film by now, or if you haven't been able to track down a copy, then at least seen a few clips of it on YouTube perhaps, so you can get a general gist of the film. And it is of course a stage play, so it's perfectly possible that some of you at some point in the past might have been to the theatre and seen Educating Rita as a play rather than as a film. We'll discuss that towards the end of the lecture. We'll start by revisiting the issues we very briefly touched on at the end of last week's lecture around pornography and views from within feminism, which are, some of the views are contradictory of each other, so we'll explore the diversity of opinion on that topic. So we'll start there. David Seltzer's definition we mentioned last week, but just a quick reminder of it before we get into other issues that we didn't touch on last week. So the definition that Seltzer offers is one that could be used in a legal context to define what constitutes porn, as well as in terms of research for social scientists and various other people who might want to engage in research. So his understanding of the matter is that pornography includes any subject matter, so that could be photographs, it could be video, it could be a painting, a drawing, pretty much anything on that front really, which is intended exclusively to sexually arouse the people who are consuming it, looking at it, watching it, reading it, whatever is the relevant style of consumption for that particular form of, what should we say, cultural expression. And that brings in fairly overt things. So a porn magazine, fairly obviously, is a magazine whose photographs and such like are just there to sexually arouse the consumer, the person reading it. It doesn't really serve any other function. It's, you know, people don't go out and buy porn magazines because they really like the crosswords, or they find the editorial column intellectually stimulating. They buy it to look at the pictures. That's what it boils down to. There is this distinction that has been debated as an ongoing topic of confusion, in that a lot of art is often erotic, involves nudity and so forth. How do we distinguish between mildly erotic art and full-on pornography? Well, if let's take an example of some ancient Greek statue of a nude woman or a nude man, there might well be people who go to a gallery or a museum and look at that statue and find it sexually exciting. They think, oh, what a very beautiful woman, what a very handsome man, I wish I could meet them in real life, etc. So there might be an element of sexual pleasure for people looking at it, but the key issue here for Seltzer would be whether the sculptor who created that statue way back when in ancient Greece, did they create it primarily so that people could get sexually excited looking at their statue, or were they creating a statue that was meant to represent a god, a goddess, some other great figure that was maybe meant to be spiritually uplifting and inspiring, or perhaps to get people to admire the art, the curves and shape of the muscles, the skill of the sculptor, where people just sit there and think, wow, that is an amazing piece of art. Was that the intention, rather than to sexually stimulate? And I assume Seltzer would say, yes, indeed, the intention was to produce some other effects, spiritual enlightenment, admiration of art, etc. And if some viewers find the statue sexually arousing because they think it's a very beautiful woman, a very handsome man, then that's not the main intention. That's a kind of a, what should I say, a bonus? It's a side effect rather than a main intention. it would also require us to reconsider certain issues. So a week or two ago, I can't remember quite when it was in the lecture series that we discussed this one, we mentioned the idea of pedal pushers, this rather niche fetish market in which some guy, or well, I'm assuming it's a guy, it could be a woman, somebody films, usually women, sometimes men, getting into cars, pressing the accelerator and driving away, and that minutes worth of film is then uploaded and aimed at people who subscribe to these websites, who do, for reasons best known to Sigmund Freud, find the prospect of a leg pushing a pedal in a car sexually exciting. Now, as we said the other week, there's no nudity, there's no sex, no one does anything that would be considered remotely erotic by most people's standards, except that the individuals who subscribe to these fetish websites, they find these films sexually titillating. Now, the intention of the filmmakers who upload direct to these websites clearly is to cater to the fetish market. So even though there is no sex by any of the usual definitions of sex, because they are intending to sexually stimulate their minority market, even if the vast majority of people who might look at such a film clip would be sitting there absolutely bewildered and thinking, what on earth is this rubbish about? Most people would not find it sexually stimulating, but because it's aimed specifically at those who do, it would therefore, by Seltzer's definition, still constitute pornography, even though it's nothing more than somebody pressing a pedal in a car and driving away. But the aim that for the particular market is a sexual aim. Therefore, in a weird way, pedal pushing and similar sorts of unusual fetishes would class as pornography in terms of the films and photographs and such like aimed at people who share those tastes. The quote we have there, moving on from David Seltzer, the quote from Susan Brownmiller, who was a leading voice in American feminism back in the 70s and afterwards. Brownmiller, like McKinnon and Dawkins and various other people we mentioned last week, is very anti-porn and sees it as a significant problem and a form of oppressing women that are photographed or filmed or drawn or in whatever other shape or guise represented in pornography. So she talks about how porn turns women into dehumanized objects to be used, abused, broken and discarded. Now, the abused and broken, certainly, especially if we're looking at sadomasochistic pornography, if a woman's being tied up and whipped or whatever, that is perhaps a very overt expression of abuse and broken. But it's worth bearing in mind that Brownmiller is talking about all pornography, including the rather, what I suppose these days would seem quite mild, the kind of stuff that was on newsagents' top shelves in 1975 would probably seem quite mild compared to what you could find on the internet within about 2 minutes of clicking a button these days. But even though it is marred by 21st century standards, nonetheless, Brownmiller included the kind of page 3 type stuff that we had in this country. I don't think they ever had that in American newspapers, Brownmiller being an American. But nonetheless, any kind of depiction, not necessarily a depiction with overt violence like sadomasochism, but just a basic pornographic depiction, she regards as dehumanizing, and the dehumanizing, turning a woman into a lump of meat to be admired, rather than being seen as a rounded, three-dimensional human being with likes and dislikes and hopes and dreams and fears and worries and happinesses and sadnesses and all the rest of it. Rather than seeing that woman as fully human, she's seen as a thing to be, well, let's be blunt, to be masturbated over, to be enjoyed, leered at by people buying the magazines or watching the videos or what have you. Is that a fair point? Is the nature of pornography to turn women into objects, things to be watched? What about any other form of art? Let's say you've got a 17th century French court painting. Nothing pornographic or erotic about it, just various women swanning around in very elaborate gowns. Are they seen as fully rounded women? Or are they just images, objects to be looked at, and people looking at them think, oh, what a very pretty gown, or whatever it is that might go through their head when they're looking at such paintings? Are the women in those paintings objects or subjects? That's an area for debate. What about men? Most porn, I would imagine, well, I don't know what the statistics are, but I'd imagine the majority of porn isn't just a woman all by herself in an image. There's an awful lot of porn which includes either films with men in them or photographs where there's a man stood next to the woman, or in whatever arrangement of body positions they might be in. Are the men in pornography also objects rather than subjects? Are they fully rounded men? Are they engaged figures, or are they subjects? Or are they objects rather? Are they just things to be either looked at in their own right, or are they ciphers for the male customers? So if it's a heterosexual man buying a porn video, is he looking at the men engaged in the video and thinking, oh, they're very muscular, or other types of things? Or is he simply looking at the women and the man in the video is a surrogate for himself rather than a person to be looked at? So if someone is just a surrogate, are they also are they therefore an object, a surrogate object? So the man in the video is doing the things that the customer, the consumer of the porn, would like to be doing themselves. What about gay pornography? Are the men involved in gay pornography dehumanized objects? Again, you're unlikely to get any sense that these are fully rounded people with likes and hopes and dreams and all the rest of that, that they're just body parts engaged in various activities that the consumer of pornography is meant to get all excited by and admire. Likewise to women if it's lesbian pornography. They're just body parts, perhaps, rather than fully rounded people. And which is an issue that Andrea Dawkins raised, that a fair amount of porn you don't even see the face, or you don't even see like the whole human body. The camera will focus in on just a breast, a thigh, a backside, or whatever, a bit of the woman's body, or in the case of gay porn, a bit of the man's body, rather than necessarily the whole human being. And so what is in reality an entire human being is reduced to sort of cuts on a butcher's slab. An arm, a leg, a breast, or whatever, a bit of a body to look at. Is that a form, which is what Dawkins argues, a kind of a reductionist, dehumanizing process, that this isn't even a real person? In a sense, I mean, obviously it is a real person, but in a sense the viewer doesn't have to think about the reality of the person in the photograph or in the movie. All they have to think about is the bit of the body that the camera is focusing in on. So is the whole thing, is Brownmiller making a fair point, or is it a point that he's broadening, so it's not only the dehumanization of women, but the dehumanization of men as well? And are the men used, abused, broken and discarded, or are they the ones doing the using, the abusing, the breaking and the discarding? How do we understand the dynamics involved, not just in the porn of the 1970s, but the stuff that's available today in, 2020? McKinnon, who again is very very opposed to pornography. One of her grounds of opposition to pornography, as well as very similar ideas that we've just mentioned from Brownmiller and Dawkins, which she broadly agrees with, McKinnon comes at it from a legal point of view. She's a legal ethicist and theorist. And she rejects the argument made in America that pornography needs to be defended as an expression of freedom of speech, that the American law guarantees freedom of speech. You can say what you like To a point, there are limits. You cannot, for example, stand up in a crowded theatre and scream fire when there is no fire, because you will cause a stampede that will lead to people being injured, and you don't have the freedom to cause injury, just as you don't have the freedom to incite murder. And so McKinnon says pornography is not freedom of speech, which some people have argued it is. She says, no, it isn't that at all, because it is incitement to violence. It's a way of, again, using, abusing, discarding, and so forth. It's a way of promoting attitudes. Now, the women in the porn may well be paid, and in some cases they might be paid quite large sums of money. And presumably a fair number of them, perhaps the majority of them, are there willingly. There may be some people who are coerced and sex trafficked and so on. But the majority of people who participate in the pornography industry do so voluntarily. So it's not necessarily that the woman in the actual photograph or video is being a subject of violence, but McKinnon's argument is more that if men consume and read and view an awful lot of pornography, and I can't quote you any statistics as to how much porn the average man consumes because I haven't researched that, but that's maybe something you want to look up yourself to see if there's any research on that one. Do a bit of background reading around it. So if the average man consumes an awful lot of pornography, McKinnon says he will begin to develop, especially if he starts viewing it when he's very young, very impressionable, very malleable in terms of attitudes and outlooks, he will start to develop a very warped view of women and start to see women in a very objectified fashion as just lumps of meat. They're laying there for his pleasure and gratification rather than being human beings in their own right, with their own likes and dislikes, their own hopes and fears and wishes and things they do want to do and things they don't want to do and all the rest of it, rather than seeing sex as a mutually shared pleasure between the man and the woman that has to be negotiated. It encourages an attitude that the woman just sort of lies there and has things done to her, and it's the men who enjoy it and the woman who just goes along with it. And that, she says, will lead to misogynist attitudes, it will lead to aggressive attitudes, that a fair amount of pornography is either sadomasochistic or it has implications of violent undertones, and it encourages a degree of contempt towards women, and so that these impressionable men who are growing up in this culture of unhealthy visual imagery will get to a point where they start expecting the women they date in the real world to behave in the way that women in porn films and magazines and so on behave. And obviously women in the real world don't behave in the way that characters and actresses, performers, whatever you want to call them, behave in the world of pornographic performance. So it sets up unrealistic expectations, and McKinnon's concern is what happens when the woman doesn't want to do what the man thinks she ought to be doing, because he's seen all of these films and magazines. Well, will he become aggressive? Will he become frustrated, violent, resentful that she isn't living up to his fantasized expectations, and become abusive as a result? The quote there from Gail Dines, who again is quite opposed. We've got two Gails here, Gail Dines on the left column on the screen and Gail Rubin on the right hand column of the screen. Gail Rubin on the right hand is what's usually referred to as sex positive, that is to say a feminist who sees pornography as a potentially positive thing, whereas Gail Dines on the left column is very much against it and countering the sorts of attitudes that Gail Rubin's and people like Gail Rubin put forward. So the quote there, anyone willing to feed off women's bodies and use them as raw materials to make a profit has no right to call themselves feminists. So there are people who have become involved as directors, filmmakers, scriptwriters, performers, what have you, in the porn industry, who say that they are creators of feminist pornography, whereas Gail Dines here is saying there ain't no such thing. You can't be a feminist and a pornographer at the one and the same time. because pornography is making profit for the filmmakers, and obviously the performers get paid a wage, and the camera people get paid a wage, and the lighting people get paid a wage, and all the rest of it. But the prime profit is for the producer of the film, rather than for the performers within the film. And so it's making a profit off of women's bodies. Again, this doesn't address issues like gay pornography and making profits off of men's bodies, or the fact that most porn films and so forth are both men and women on the screen at the same time. So if they're making a profit off women's bodies, they're also making a profit off of men's bodies at the same time. And it's just a kind of one-sided focus. But then, that is often the case. Is Gail Dines right? Is Catherine McKinnon right? This is obviously where, in the normal run of things, we'd be pausing for a debate, and therefore maybe you can get yourself a coffee, put the video on pause, think about it, mull it over, bounce a few ideas around with other classmates through social media. If you'd like, we could set up the chat function on Brightspace, which enables us to all kind of fire off messages to one another, and we can all see each other's messages. It's a little bit like Facebook chat, that kind of thing. And discuss some of these issues. If you'd like to do that, we can set up a particular time slot to do that in. Can you be a feminist and a producer or consumer of pornography? Or are those two things mutually exclusive? Is the female experience of pornography significantly different from the male experience? Here I'm talking about the people appearing in the films and the videos and the photographs and whatnot, more so than the consumers. There are women who like pornography. So it's not just male. I dare say the majority probably of people who buy pornography, I would guess, again I don't have any statistics to hand, but I would guess are probably men. Be interesting to see if there are reliable statistics on this, although I can't imagine too many people would be upfront and admit to how much porn they buy or download or whatever. But you never know, some people might be upfront about that. There developed a rift within the feminist movements, particularly at the 1982 conference, the Barnard Conference on Sexuality, where people of McKinnon's outlook, the sort of the anti-porn movement, if you can put them in that way, the ones who saw pornography as being misogynistic and damaging and harmful, clashed with a relatively small number of people at that time, back in 82, but a larger number of people nowadays as the decades have moved on and it's become a more widespread stance to take of women and male feminists who said that pornography can be a positive thing. Emphasis on the word can be. They're not saying every single example of pornography is positive at all. They are agreed that a lot of pornography is harmful and damaging, but their argument is that it could be positive. It can be made in a positive way as sex positive. That is to say, something that celebrates sexuality rather than takes what they perceive as being a somewhat prudish attitude from people on the anti-lobby. The people on the anti-lobby don't regard themselves as prudes, but the people on the pro-lobby tend to think of them as being quite prudish and disapproving of things that they want to celebrate. So the pro-lobby looks to celebrate sexuality and says pornography is one of the means by which sexuality can be celebrated. Female sexuality as much as male sexuality. And so that was one of the groups involved in the protest was the Feminist Anti-Censorship Task Force, FACT. So their perception is that the anti-lobby are not protecting women so much as they are censoring freedom of speech, and that's why, again, the kind of issue is flagged up there with McKinnon saying, actually, this isn't about freedom of speech. This is about something else entirely. Gail Rubin's approach, the other Rubin on the right hand, the Gail on the right hand column, was to say that the most constructive thing the feminists could start doing to counter harmful, damaging pornography was to start participating in the porn industry as scriptwriters, directors, producers, distributors, financiers, and potentially even as stars in front of the camera, to create porn that caters to women's sexual tastes and promotes sensuality, kindness, compassion, mutual concern, so that sex would be seen as for both sexes, not just a kind of wham bam, thank you man, centred on the men in the films and the male audience, but would be made for a female audience as well as a male audience, would be made in which women were in control of their bodies rather than just being lumps of meat subjected to the demands of men. It would be done in a very different way. And so Rubens was not the only voice saying this. Other women started saying it, and some feminist men started saying it, that yes, we can create such a thing as feminist pornography. There were companies set up in America, in Germany, and various other places to create expressly this notion of, I suppose what we could say is politicized pornography, or pornography made with a different political agenda than the default approach that was in place in the porn mod before this issue was raised as a topic of concern. So one of the concerns around the impact of pornography is that it might be harmful. It might be harmful to the people appearing in front of the camera if they are only doing it because they're desperate for money, or if they are being pressurized into engaging in harmful, dangerous activities like unprotected sex. They might get HIV. There were, certainly if we go back to the 1980s and 90s, a spate of cases of both prominent female and male porn stars who had appeared in a ridiculously large number of films, who had contracted HIV and various other quite serious infections. That led to some places, for example, in America, California, introduced laws that say the adult film industry has to have mandatory testing of its performers for sexually transmitted diseases on a regular basis, so that if they are found to be infected with something, then they are banned from performing, at least until after they're cured or treated, to reduce the transmission of diseases. And it has, I can't quote you any financial details on this in terms of financial ratio, but I've certainly seen research suggesting that those porn films in which the actors are using contraception, let's say condoms, specifically condoms rather than other types of contraception, are in less demand and go for a smaller financial cost, fee, whatever the term is, than those porn films in which the stars do not wear condoms. So that's both straight pornography and gay pornography, in which they're not using condoms, they're having unprotected sex. That apparently audiences that is, will pay more to watch the unprotected ones than they will to watch the protected ones. I don't know how much more, I can't sort of quote you how much more profit is made by one type of film than the other type of film, but simply that this has been flagged up as an issue. The research I saw was going back a couple of decades now, so things may have moved on. Will people pay more to watch harm, or potential harm? Well, if they even conceive of it as being harmful, that is. The audiences may not think of it in the context of harm. I don't quite know what would be going through people's minds if they say, I'd sooner watch a condom-less film than a film with condoms in it. I don't know. But that's an area of research. What are the harms involved? And McKinnon's point is the harms aren't only confined to the people in front of the camera, that they are also impacting those watching the films or buying the magazines or reading the torrid books, whatever it might be. That it has a long-term impact on how they come to understand sex, how they start to think about their own sexual proclivities, how they start to think about what's normal, what's abnormal, what's reasonable to expect of a sex life, and how they start to treat their sexual partners. So if someone consumes a lot of pornography in whichever guise, the very nature of pornographic films is that films and books and photographs and whatnot is that people are usually portrayed as having incredibly active sex lives, that they are having 10 partners a day and having sex every single day without fail. That the sex they're having with each other is astoundingly athletic and involves swinging from lampshades and doing all sorts of remarkably bizarre things. Are these reasonable expectations of a standard, ordinary sex life? Is it setting up a false expectation, particularly for the very young who don't have much actual experience to compare to? So it's one thing if you are, I suppose, middle-aged and you know the difference between a real sex life and a fantasized sex life as presented in a porn film, but it's a different thing if you are 14, 15, you've never had sex in your life and all you know about sex is what you've gathered from going online and looking at naughty videos. Might give you a very unrealistic expectation as to what people will be willing to get up to, how often they should be getting up to it, all that sort of thing. So there's the one perspective that says, well, pornography sets up very unrealistic expectations. It puts pressure on ordinary women who are then dating men who've seen it's not always, but sometimes dating men who've seen an awful lot of porn and have very unrealistic expectations. It's because you're getting used to, back to this objectification issue, the viewers are getting used to seeing female bodies, and you could certainly argue male bodies, as objects, and therefore not as people but as things. Do the heavy-duty consumers of porn start to see their prospective girlfriends, wives, boyfriends, husbands as things, objects rather than people? And did they start to see themselves in the same way? Or, counter-argument from the pro-sexuality lobby, that someone who sees a lot of porn attains a level of sexual release and lowers their sexual tensions, therefore they are less likely to go out and start pressurising others because they are, how can we put this politely, taking care of their own needs in the privacy of their own home, hopefully, rather than necessarily getting all very sort of sexually frustrated and going out there and venting their sexual frustrations on the people they meet. Evidence for one way or the other is difficult to establish because the nature of the arguments being made are quite woolly and hard to key into for reliable and ethical research, because clearly you could end up doing some very unethical research in this area. It could easily become quite dodgy. Research that's more ethically based is difficult to engage in. Now, this photo you might remember from the previous week is one of these silicone sex doll things that sort of slightly robotized it to a point and cost a fortune, and very strange men, possibly some very strange women, buy them and spend a fortune on them, and then give them names and dress them up and do things with them. Not just sexual things. We mentioned that rather odd man who had half a dozen of them all sat around a dinner table, all dressed up, and spoke to them and had dinner parties with them. So he was sort of engaging with them socially, if that's quite the right way to describe engaging with a lump of silicon, as well as sexually. So they meet a number of different, slightly odd needs. But when we talked about them last week, we did highlight that there were theorists who were concerned that, again, this would promote objectification. That if you have a man who is very used to spending time with a lump of silicon, are they going to become less and less capable of spending time with an actual human being because they're used to a lump of silicon that does as it's told, that never has headaches, that will do anything it's required to do because it's not capable of saying no? Will they start to expect the same of actual flesh and blood people? Perhaps so. Julia Long's quote there is, again, reiterating the previous quotes we've looked at, this idea that porn becomes a form of violence, becomes a form of objectification. So whether we're talking a lump of silicon, or whether we're talking a magazine, or a video, it's a very old-fashioned word to use, isn't it, video, online streamed pornography, is all of it a form of objectification, a form of rather than dealing with a real human being who will sometimes say, no, I don't want to do that, or I've got a headache, or my back hurts, or whatever it is that they're going to say. And then the man or the woman having to negotiate around this and just sort of adapt to being with an actual human being with actual range of needs. If they have a compliant lump of silicon or a compliant celluloid image, although if it's online it's not celluloid, is it? But never mind. Someone who in porn films, the women don't go, sorry love, I've got a headache, I'm not doing it tonight. They're always ready for anything no matter what. Just as the men are always ready for anything no matter what. Which is worth bearing in mind that if you've got, well, whether it's a woman watching porn or a man watching porn, the way the men are presented also has an impact as well as the way the women are presented, in terms of how we understand the impact on the viewer. Does it turn people into objects rather than subjects? So again and again, coming back to this issue, this notion. Johan Galtung talks about cultural violence. It's building on Bourdieu's symbolic violence, which, just for a quick revisit in case you've forgotten what that is, Bourdieu argued that as well as actual violence, punching someone or kicking them or whatever, you have symbolic violence in which it's not real violence. It's an enactment of something which alludes to violence and suggests or implies violence. So Galtung builds on this and says, as well as an individual image of symbolic violence, you develop entire cultures of violence in which we're not talking actual beating people up, we're talking metaphorical violence. So is pornography, which is a part of Galtung's argument here, is pornography and other forms of medium part of promoting a culture of violence in which certain groups of people have to do as they're told, because if they don't, ... fill in the gap, something unpleasant will happen to you, so you've got to say yes to whatever demand is made upon you. So the person, otherwise, they don't have to threaten to beat you up, because there is the implicit notion that if you say no and refuse, there will be violence, and therefore it's implied rather than actual. Is that a fair point? So is porn part of a culture of legitimising violence towards women, or possibly even towards men? In some cases, gay pornography, that sort of thing. Hitler promoted his notion of the Herrenvolk, which he uses as a term to describe the superior race, the Aryan race, which is what it was in Hitler's mind, and indeed in the minds of modern-day 21st century Nazis, the superior race of all of the races on Earth. If you associate that, link that into Galtung's argument, by saying this racial group is better than every other racial group, there is implicit violence towards those other racial groups. So even if you're not actually advocating attacking them outright, nonetheless it automatically puts them into an inferior position, a position of obedience, submissiveness, where they have to do as they're told, with the implication that if they don't do as they're told, something nasty will happen, and maybe restricts their access so that they don't get the same goodies going as the superior race gets. There's all sorts of levels of that going along. Julia Long's argument would place, rather than talking about the Herrenvolk, the Aryan race, to say that pornography is implying that men are the superior gender, that what men want done has to be done for them in sexual context. So if they want this sexual act rather than that sexual act, then that has to be done. And the women are not there to say, oh no thank you, or no that's going to hurt, or anything like that. If it's demanded of them, they have to do it, because the sexual appetites of the men in the porn are the dominating factor, not the sexual appetites of the women. Now, those women like Ruben, who would say, well, what about feminist pornography? We could create a feminist pornography in which women's sexual appetites and preferences and likes and dislikes are being catered to, and it's not all about the men. So that would say, well, you could change the subtext of pornography to get away from that, whereas maybe Long would say, well, that's a pipe dream, it's not going to happen, because porn, at least the type of porn that sells in significant numbers and makes a big profit, is geared towards the selfish demands of some men. And I'm trying to emphasise it's some men, because I don't want to give the impression that sometimes comes across with some of the writings we're looking at here, that all men think in a certain way and have a very demanding, selfish attitude. We are talking about some men. But the notion is perhaps that those some men have enough of a disposable income to keep the porn industry very, very lucrative, and mainstreams it. We could particularly say that in this day and age, more so than back in the 70s, in this day and age when pornography is only 3 clicks of a mouse away, is it so easily available to people of all age groups, including the very impressionable young. Once upon a time, to acquire pornography, somebody would have had to go into a newsagent's or a sex shop and buy stuff off a top shelf, and it was all a bit furtive, and if somebody was very young, they would be thrown out the shop, or the shopkeeper would refuse to sell to them. As in this day and age, that internet availability and culture so swamp the market that the ideas contained within it are just everywhere, not in one group of people making a conscious decision to purchase, but amongst all sorts of people who are being inadvertently exposed. A bit like advertising, you could say it's nigh on impossible to get away from advertising. Even if you don't buy a newspaper and magazines and look at the adverts there, you walk past a billboard in the streets, you'll hear adverts on the radio, on other people's radios, other people's TV sets. You go online to look at something irrelevant and you'll get bombarded with adverts. It's almost impossible to get away from advertising because it's everywhere. Is the same true of porn today, unlike, let's say, in 1975, when it was more confined to certain places and only accessible to certain people? So has things moved on significantly? People who dislike the idea of symbolic violence and cultural violence, actually dislike it, reject it as a nonsense, say that will argue that it's inappropriate to compare a photograph, an image, a notion put across in a novel or a book to actual violence. So a slightly offensive photograph is not the same as being punched in the face. It's not violence. Violence is not the correct word to use. It may be undesirable, but it is not violence. And so therein is a question in itself. Should the term violence be confined exclusively to punching, kicking, and shoving and elbowing people in the face? Or should it be extended, as is commonly done these days, certainly once we get into the 21st century, it becomes very commonplace to spread the term violence to acts of speech, to photographs, to films, to images, to ideas, to language, to talk about violent ideas rather than actual physical violence. Is this a wise move, or does society need to rein its horns in on that one and reconsider what violence actually is? We've got a set of photographs here, which, again, it would be nice to discuss these as a class, bounce your ideas around rather than me just telling you what I think to get your ideas, but we could still do that through social media. Are these adverts pornographic? They're obviously not full-on sex, but sex is heavily implied in all four of these photographs. How do we analyse the semiotics, the imagery, the context of these photographs, of these adverts? The lady getting the turkey out of the oven, dressed in the weirdest thing that you'd want. Why on earth you'd want to go near a hot oven and a roasting turkey dressed like that? I can't begin to imagine. But that clearly is a very odd, presumably, I was going to say male fantasy. I suppose it might be a lesbian fantasy as well. But it's an unrealistic perception of how a woman should behave or dress if she's engaged in cooking a turkey. If nothing else, it has a fantasy element. It's the whole sort of slightly submissive posture, bending over, looking to camera, looking to what presumably is because Lynx is a product sold for men. Is she looking at the man who's looking at the Lynx can and considering if he buys a can of Lynx deodorant, or in this case antiperspirant, will he find suddenly very glamorous women in skimpy clothing not only cooking him a nice turkey dinner but bending over and offering themselves to him? That's often a kind of a subtext for a lot of Lynx advertising, that some rather lumpy looking bloke sprays it on and there's 1,000 women in bikinis running across the beach to throw themselves at him. The ultimate straight boys fantasy there. We could read a great deal more into that advert, but clearly it's not full on porn, but it's somewhat going towards a soft porn, shall we say. It's an image full of sexual connotations. What about the Gucci advert bottom left there? The man staring straight to camera, the woman staring up at him. The man is dominant over her, or at least he's at the top of the picture, she's at the bottom of the picture. Is the implication therefore that he is dominant over her? She is all sorts of submissive and oohing and ahhing whilst he has his way. And if he is looking to camera, looking out of the poster at the customer, Pour Gucci Guilty Bron is an aftershave for men. So he's looking at the man. The male customer could be looking at a woman customer who's thinking of buying this for her husband as a birthday present or something. But presumably he's meant to be looking at the male customer. Is it sort of a hint that, I wear this aftershave, look what I've got, you could, if you buy this aftershave, you could have this too. You'll have women going all weak-kneed and falling before you whilst you have your wicked way with them. That said, a fair amount of aftershave statistics show is actually not bought by men so much as bought by their wives, by their girlfriends, by their sisters, mothers, what have you, when they're buying birthday presents and Christmas presents and Valentine's Day presents and all of that sort of palaver. So quite who is this actually marketed to? Because it's a male-oriented product doesn't necessarily mean that the advert works best with male customers. It might work just as well with female customers buying on behalf of their male relations. So who is being sold to here? Both the man and the woman in that photo are very good looking. So is the idea that the woman is just the object and the man is the dominant subject factor here? Or are they both actually objects? So some people will be gazing admiringly at the woman and some people will be gazing admiringly at the man. Some at both. Who's object, who's subject? Moving across to the American Apparel argument, we're going back to Dworkin's idea of body parts. So in this one, we don't even see a whole woman, we just see her legs up in the air. And obviously the clear implication here, although American Apparel is selling a clothing brand, the shirt and the trousers and what have you, I don't know if they sell shoes on it actually, so maybe the shoes are also part of the advert, I'm not too sure on that stuff. But the implication here, buy the clothing and you'll look so good that women will spread their legs for you. Not just spread them, but the man in there holding her ankles, Yeah, so is she spreading willingly, or is he just kind of doing it for her? Maybe we should gloss over that one and the implications there. But clearly there is an issue of dominance here. So again, the man is at the top, the woman at the bottom of the picture. Same as for the Gucci advert. Is this a men on top image, which you can take either as a reference to the missionary position in sex, or as a more broad sweeping sociological statement about men being in a more dominant, controlling position than women are in society. At least that's the image put across. Whether that's the reality of society or not is another question, but it's the advertising image perhaps that's being put across here. So again, is the American apparel advert, and there's no actual sex taking place, but clearly there is a heavy hint that it's going to at any minute. Is it pornographic? We're back to this sort of argument what we had right at the beginning about how we define porn. The purpose of these adverts is to sell clothes and scents and what have you. It's not to make people sexually aroused, you could say, so it's perhaps not porn in that sense. But there's clearly a heavy sexual element to all of these adverts, which makes them border a little bit on the edge of being slightly pornographic, or at least erotic, if not pornographic. And how do we distinguish between erotic art and sexual pornographic art? Not a clear-cut thing. Finally, you've got the Dolce & Gabbana advert top right there, which is two men. It's part of a bigger picture, and the whole picture is of men sitting around a table. Some of them, like the guy there, just in their shorts, and others with slashed shirts, like the man in the white shirt there. So revealing a bit of flesh, looking all very sweaty and very intense and very kind of Latin lover type thing going on there. Is that an image meant to appeal to women? So going back to this idea from Gail Rubin, that could you have an erotic pornographic element that is heavily intended to appeal to women, or is this appealing to gay guys, or is it appealing to both? Is there a difference between what is sexually stimulating for gay men and what's sexually stimulating for straight women when they're looking at a man? In other words, can the same image meet the preferences of both markets, or does each market have different preferences? Therefore, the adverts would have to be tailored differently. Are the two men in that picture, perhaps most especially the one in the shorts, are they being objectified as lumps of meat? No, you can see more of the men in that picture than you can see of the woman in the American apparel advert underneath it. You can see about as much of those two men as you can of the woman in the Lynx advert. It's almost a full body image. Obviously the eye is being drawn towards certain parts and locations. The man is all holding a knife to cut an apple or whatever it is that he's about to cut up. Is that simply a knife related to food consumption, or is he holding his weapon to misses? In which case we get into lots of very Freudian phallic territory there. Or is it a threat? He's holding that knife, which, as well as cutting up apples and pears and whatnot, could be used obviously as a threat. Is there an implicit threat in that image? Does the threat, if there is one at all, make it more sexually attractive? So is this some sort of alpha male aggressive, you will have sex with me or else type image? Is that seen as menacing and off-putting, or is that actually seen as more exciting? Because there are women, there are gay men, there are people who will find a more forceful, domineering man much more appealing than a meek, mild, gentle one. So it would not be off-putting for everyone. To some people that would be more exciting than someone who was holding a bunch of flowers, for example. So again, how do we contextualise this? And is this an example, the Gabbana advert, of equality? But equality in the sense of everyone being treated equally badly rather than everyone being treated equally well? Because equality can go in either direction, of course, going back to that argument we had a few weeks ago, that the word equality in and of itself is a bit meaningless. It doesn't necessarily mean better treatment for everyone. It could mean worse treatment for everyone. because fundamentally it just means the same treatment for everyone, not a statement about the quality of that treatment. So for men looking at this, I don't know how Paul would feel about this, or Carl. Do you see this as uncomfortable as an image? Does it make you feel objectified? Do you feel pressured to compare and conform? As often a lot of women will argue, it'd be interesting to see what the views of the women who are in the class are regarding the Lynx advert and so on, or the Gucci advert. But as women, do you feel that you're being pressured to conform, to compare to the glamour models in those shots? Do the men feel pressured and compelled to perform to the men in the Gabbana or the guy in the Gucci advert there? You can't see a head. And we're going back to this body part argument of Dawkins' bit about objectification. As well as the woman who is just now a pair of legs, well, the man is just a torso. You can't see his face. So is he being depersonalised, the guy in the American Apparel advert, because he doesn't have a face, he doesn't have a head? So aside from his two arms, I mean, you know he's white, that's about it. We know nothing else about him. Is he now just a lump of meat as well as the woman with her legs in the air being a lump of meat? How do we understand any of these images and the implicit messages? Are these examples of symbolic violence? You must be submissive in the kitchen and the bedroom. You must be dominated and owned by your handsome husband or lover with his Gucci aftershave. You must spread your legs for the guy with the American Apparel, or you must sit there looking all sweaty and for women, perhaps, or another man, perhaps, sprayed up with your Dolce Gabbana. I say sprayed up, maybe it's the clothes they're advertising rather than the perfume, I'm not too sure. And possibly, does it even matter quite what they're advertising there? Because it's less about the product than more about the flesh that's on display. We could talk about this endlessly, and if you want to do it through Brightspace chat function, we can do it there, or you might just want to talk amongst each other. Entirely up to you how you want to explore these topics. Right, this is where I wish I'd made a cup of coffee at the start of this podcast. Never mind. There are other criticisms to be made, both for and against. So Alice Schwarzer is one of, and quite a few people have made this same sentiment, one of the voices that says porn is very unrealistic, largely because, and we could also say not just porn, also those adverts we've just this second looked at, are very unrealistic because the very nature of the product tends to mean that most of the people who appear in them are very unrealistic in their appearance. Now that could be because they're super duper glamorous Dolce Gabbana models, or it could be that they are porn stars who've had so much silicone implanted in them they need help standing up. Or men who are so gifted, if we can put it like that, that horses look enviously upon them. So someone who is consuming a great deal of pornography might have a very unrealistic expectation of what men and women should look like. And certainly if they're very young and naive and impressionable, then will they grow up feeling very inadequate? So in other words, it's not just necessarily 15-year-old lads looking at women with enormous endowments in porn films and wishing they could find a girl who was equally enormously endowed. But are they also going to be looking at the guys in the porn films who might well be very endowed themselves, and then those 15-year-old boys feeling very inadequate because they're not human tripods in quite the same way? Therefore, does this lead to regular consumers of pornography feeling very inadequate? Not just because they don't have sex 15 times a day the way people in porn do, and swing from lampshades and all the rest of it, but because their bodies are not as fantastically sculpted or remarkably gifted as the people appearing in these films and magazines and so forth tend to be. So does that have an impact? And that argument has been made not just about porn, but about advertising broadly, that it's all too unfeasibly glamorous. So if you are slightly more ordinary looking, then you're going to feel overshadowed. And perhaps sit there thinking, well, no one's going to want to date me because I don't look like this super glamorous thing I've seen in the films. Camille Paglia echoes similar arguments, but also focuses not quite so much just on the sculpted bodies, but upon the nature of the activities. I'm trying to be all terribly coy here, but let's say people in explicit movies and magazines and whatnot are often engaged in activities that would probably put a lot of ordinary people off if they got asked to engage in said activity during the course of a date. So you might well go home and have more conventional sex, straightforward sex, be happy with that, but not necessarily want to be doing some of the spectacularly bizarre things. And not even just spectacularly bizarre. You can listen to Palia's broadcasts on YouTube, her lectures and what have you, where she is somewhat more graphic than I'm trying to be here. And she says that if you are let's say a 15-year-old schoolgirl, and all you know about sex is from what you might have seen online, or heard boys bragging about online, even if you yourself don't look at much. So not the boys bragging online, but boys bragging in the playground about what they have seen online, I should have said. You might feel pressurised to engage in sexual activities before you're ready, when you're too young, in fact illegally young in the case of a 15-year-old. But even if you were 16 and it's legal, that you still wouldn't necessarily be ready for it, but you might feel pressurised because that's what everyone around you is saying they think is normal and expected because of what they've seen online or in magazines. And you might be pressured into performing particular activities you don't really want to do because they're painful or unpleasant or whatever else. But your partner has seen stuff online and they think, well, they do it in the films, why don't you do it too? And it pressurises people, and Paglia starts to quote some rather unpleasant statistics in one of her particular lectures around A&E admissions at local hospitals from people who've actually got injured. I shouldn't laugh really because it's not a pleasant subject, but it does sound slightly comical. Or people who've engaged in activities, perhaps trying to emulate stuff they've seen in porn films, only to realise that they are not as limber as the stars in the films, and they can't quite manage to do what the people in the films do, and so they fall off the chandelier and land on the floor, or do some rather more unsavoury internal damage to themselves as a result of trying to make real what fundamentally is more of a fantasy than anything. And she points this out as actually becoming of increasing concern, because often the people involved in these accidents and problems are getting younger and younger and younger, again because of the pervasiveness of the internet and the easy access to very, very extreme images. And this is another point Paglia and others pick up on. Stuff that might have been considered shocking in 1970 seems incredibly tame when compared to things online, easily available online. We're not talking dark net, super freaky things, but easily available online type stuff in 2020 is way weirder. And is this an impact of the nature of internet porn? The media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who was writing some incredibly influential books back in the 60s, had a quote: "The medium is the message." The very way in which, whether it's in a newspaper, on a TV program, on the radio, what have you, the very way in which something is disseminated will change the nature of that which is being disseminated. And is this true of porn as much as it is true of, let's say, news broadcasts, which is the thing that interested Marshall McLuhan? I don't think he ever said anything about pornography, as I recall. So porn in a magazine is it's substantially different from porn online. Online, not only have you got the ease of access, but demand, much heavier demand. If it's there, people will tend to consume it because it's so easy to get hold of, and it creates the illusion of anonymity, that you don't have the embarrassment of going into a shop and buying something off the top shelf and the newsagent looking at you in mild disgust or whatever, that you can access weirder and weirder things online quite easily and believe yourself to be anonymous in the process. Does that change the nature of what's offered? Do producers of porn in 2020 feel compelled to compete to an extent they never had to compete in 1970, to not just put out what you might call bog standard porn, but to put out really weird stuff, getting weirder and weirder with every year that passes? Parlia argues, yes, there is this drive to grotesquerie, to excess, and that drive exists largely because of the very nature of the internet. Pre-internet, you didn't have the same pressure there, the same drive. There were magazines in 1970 catering to really gross tastes, but they were a real minority thing and only available in very specialist dodgy sex shops, with even then often under the counter. Whereas these days, 3 clicks of a button, you've got anything you like under the sun to look at. An issue to think about. Right, so Tibbles argues that outlawing pornography, which is a move that people like McKinnon and so forth have strongly suggested and encouraged as something to move towards, Tibbles says actually that would backfire, it would be worse. Because if you drive something underground, you can't legislate around it, you can't control for it. Whereas, as Per mentioned earlier, that in California they'd introduced this law that the sex industry has to have regular STD testings and so forth. If it was illegal, you wouldn't have any of that. So you would have an underground criminal porn production market that would not have to introduce or utilise testing for sexually transmitted diseases. Therefore, rather than making it safer for the performers, by outlawing it, stamping it, trying to stamp it out, Tibble says, well, you wouldn't succeed in stamping out, you just drive it underground, and the very act of driving it underground would make it far more risky. So you wouldn't have things like the same age checks to make sure all of the performers are of the right age of consent. So you would then, you'd get into some really murky, dark places on that one. Robin Morgan, flashing back to the late 70s, she said pornography is the theory and rape is the practice. Again, this idea that pornography is harmful because it incites attitudes to women that they've got to be submissive and do as they're told and go along with whatever on earth the man wants to do. They have to go along with all of that, therefore it becomes translated into reality. Heavy-duty consumers of porn, Morgan suggested, are more likely to engage in rape. Not the kind of stocking mask on the head dragged into a dark alleyway type of rape, but having sex with a, up till that point, consenting woman, and suddenly the man says, I want to do this weird thing, and the woman says no, and the man is so used to compliant women in pornography that he has no comprehension of the word no in that context, and what was consenting then becomes rape. It's kind of an argument that Morgan was putting forward. Is she right? Is she wrong? Something to discuss and explore. Ellen Willis, by contrast, is in the quote there, as we saw it, the claim that pornography is violence against women, that's the sort of thing Morgan noticed, was code for the neo-Victorian idea that men want sex and women endure it. So again, there's this the anti-argument is people are Willis right? Are they right in suggesting that the disapproval of pornography is based upon the assumption that it's only men who want pornography because men are sex-mad beasts which is a very Victorian attitude, and that women are pristine martyrs who don't like that sort of thing. They just lie there, think of England and grit their teeth. And therefore there is no female appetite for sexually explicit material. So is this just Victorianism dressed up as feminism? And indeed you could argue that on quite a number of points, particularly I think with third wave feminism. To what extent is it repackaging Victorian attitudes and calling it feminism, when in fact it has its roots in Victorian patriarchy? Possibly a bit controversial there, but a question to ask. So Ellen Willis is one of the people who sees pornography as having a role within feminism where it is more controlled by a female agenda. So it will be put out with a different emphasis, a different slant to the types of porn that are more commonplace these days. Faludi raises the issue that within the porn industry, female performers get usually paid way more than male performers. So if we're talking gender pay gap, this is an example where the gender pay gap is in favour of women rather than in favour of men. So do we start having demands for equality, that male porn stars get paid as much as women? Do we treat it as just another career avenue? Or does this have to be viewed in a rather different light, as something to be discouraged rather than something that is just another job to consider? And you're at a party and you say to someone, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" They go, "Oh, I'm a doctor." And they go, "Oh, that's nice." And then you say to the next person, "What do you do for a living?" And they go, "Oh, I'm a porn star." Do you respond with, "Oh, that's nice"? Or is appearing in pornography to be understood in a very different light to more mainstream types of career and employment? Something to think about there. Okay, sorry about that silly thing cropping up there. Continuing with a bit more research, we've got Shaw and Sader here. In terms of consumer understanding of pornography, they carried out surveys that asked people how they rated the likability of various forms of porn. So they showed them different images and so forth, and got them to score the porn as a, do you like this a lot, a little bit, not a lot, not at all, and so forth. And the people they surveyed favoured more mild, soft, whatever your phrase you want to use, forms of pornography, more kind of regular types, just people having fairly ordinary sex, as higher, more preferable, more likeable, more something they'd want to watch than porn that was very graphic, very explicit, included S&M, slapping people around, that sort of stuff. That actually, that sort of aggressive pornography, they felt, Sean Cedar this is, was a real minority taste rather than a mainstream one. So they suggested that the notion that people start watching the mild stuff and then they go on to harder and harder and harder. So it's almost like the gateway drug argument made around cannabis. You start with the soft stuff and then you get into the harder and harder stuff, for which there is no evidence at all. That there is no sort of soft gateway drug except possibly alcohol leading people into harder and harder stuff. Likewise, Sean Sage was saying there isn't really a gateway porn, that you start at the mild end and then you end up watching whips and chains and Lord knows what else after a year or two, which is the radical feminist argument from the 70s. It corrupts and it gets worse and worse and worse. They're saying, well, actually, by and large, most people know it doesn't. So that those individuals who do want the very extreme graphic stuff probably started out wanting the extreme graphic stuff. They didn't just kind of fall into it by accident. They developed those habits due to some deeper rooted, probably rather Freudian issue within themselves. It's not down to mere social conditioning because of the availability of porn. Now, we'll leave porn to one side. I dare say that will be a bit of a relief. So you might want to have a cup of tea, a cold shower, cheese sandwich, whatever. Pause the video, then come back, and we'll shift into talking about educating the sexes and differences in education. So, gender plays a role in education, and there's knowledge of that being an issue for quite a long time now. Up until comparatively recently, we'll go back 150-ish, give or take, years, education for women was drastically limited compared to education for men. But going back to that time frame, we are specifically talking about education for the upper classes, because education for the lower classes was drastically limited for everyone, male or female. There was hardly any education for anyone, no matter gender. So upper class boys had more educational opportunities than upper class girls did, before that eventually evened out. And this is where we'd have a bit of a pause and a discussion as to whether you think, and any sort of personal experiences any of you might have regarding this issue, that single-sex schools, all girls schools, all boys schools, are they better, more effective than mixed-sex schools in terms of academic excellence? Are they better in terms of social skills? So do boys who've gone to all boys schools find it difficult to talk to girls when they graduate, and vice versa for girls at all girls schools? Or are social skills just as well developed regardless of whether they're in a mixed school or a single sex school? How should we understand these issues? Should the sex segregation in schools extend to the teaching staff as well as the students? In other words, should, let's say, an all-female school have all-female teachers, an all-male school have all-male teachers, or is a mixture better? What about the notion of gender-neutral education? So education in which choice of imagery, choice of subject matter tries to promote equal and identical opportunities for male and female students alike, rather than pushing female students in one direction and male students in another. So back when I was young, there was an encouragement that boys would do things like woodwork and girls would do home economics. So whilst, let's say, the maths class or the history class, it was gender was neither here nor there, there were specific classes that were pushed on boys and others that were pushed on girls as being more useful for their future life outside of school. Whereas a gender-neutral education would say effectively everyone studies the same things. There is a movement away from emphasis on one gender over another in terms of topic and style of teaching and so forth. But again, social media, you can chat around those issues amongst yourselves or with me via the Brightspace chat function. Let me know what you would like to do. We have a number of different educational theories at play. So we'll start with the main effects model. That says that gender starts to impact on both boys and girls' level of achievement. So we are looking in terms of, there's a teleological argument here. How do you measure academic, or how do you measure the success of a school? Is it just in terms of academic achievement, A-levels, O-levels, GCSEs, all the rest of it? Or do you have to factor in other issues too? So this is focusing mainly on the academic achievement more than anything else. And the argument here is that gender cuts across things like social class and ethnicity, so that you get the same differences and the same distinctions in achievements of boys and girls, whether we're talking about black boys, Asian boys, white boys, posh girls, middle class girls, working class girls. Regardless of those issues, it's gender that is the distinguishing factor, and that can be charted indeed over age groups, so that there are certain points where, in certain year groups, where girls will tend to be doing better than boys, and then other year groups where boys will be tending to do better than girls. And that in itself is also subject dependent. So, i.e., they'll do better in some subjects but not in other subjects. So it's shifting patterns. And that's seen as more innate to do with biological factors, the actual gender, than, let's say, teaching styles or anything like that, which could be varied and shifted and changed. Then you have the competing interactions effects model, which goes down a different line and says, well, actually, no, we don't think that the gender is the key issue. We think that other factors like race and social class are more key factors in determining different patterns of educational outcome. So in other words, one that says gender is a key issue, and the other theory that says no, gender isn't, it's these other factors, it's race, class, teaching styles, various other things you can look at that determines academic success and academic outcome. In terms of patterns of how this tends to pan out with research, Connolly's research looked at lads from marginalised backgrounds, poor backgrounds, minority ethnic community backgrounds and so on, and certainly saw class as a critical issue in terms of developing what's referred to as anti-school subcultures. So boys that go, oh God, school's so boring, why do we have to do this, and don't want to be there, resent it, see it as pointless and stupid, and that anyone who does study hard is a swat or an egghead or some other slightly derogative term. And an issue there, something that Connolly picked up, is that this isn't just the boys in and of themselves developing these attitudes. They often are shared by the parents, and indeed you could argue probably stem from the parents, that the parents don't much like school and they pass those attitudes on to their sons more so than to their daughters, in terms of also not much liking school and resenting being at school, seeing it as pointless and so forth. So it becomes a multi-generational issue. By contrast, when Connolly was studying boys from middle-class backgrounds, going to grammar schools, sort of posher, more upmarket schools, their masculinity manifested, Connolly argues, not in being the stroppy, awkward kid at the back of the class that doesn't want to go along with what the teacher is requesting that they do, but rather manifested itself in competition and competitiveness with the other lads at the school. So they're trying to outdo each other. That would be outdoing each other both in terms of academic success, but also on the sports field, seeing who could win the most awards or get the highest score in, well, if it's a middle class school, probably cricket or rugby rather than football. And so it improved their effectiveness when they left school, that they'd leave school with better qualifications and so forth, and then have greater access to colleges and universities than boys from working class backgrounds who hadn't done so well because of that anti-school attitude. And so they would be all, from the poor background, they'd be establishing their masculinity by seeing who could be the most disruptive, awkward bugger in the class, and the middle class boys would be establishing their masculinity by seeing who could get the biggest score at cricket or do the most well in the maths test, that sort of thing. So for Connolly, class is as much an issue as gender on this subject. So this is where we would be pausing for thought for a discussion, and again, I keep saying this, we can still have these discussions through social media rather than other routes. And just sort of, it slows down the process something like that sort. But there's a big push in modern day 21st century British schools that I say we here, I'm talking about the teachers. And so when I say schools, I don't just mean schools for children, I mean college, university, the whole way through from primary up to university level of education. So that teaching staff are pushing issues and agendas around politics, as well as teaching history or geography or chemistry or whatever their primary subject is, So they're now expected to address things like sexism, homophobia, racism, not just in terms of, let's say, a kid blurts out something that's a bit dodgy in the class, but also even down to something like you're doing a PowerPoint. You may have noticed this from PowerPoints I've put up for you over the years. And in that PowerPoint, you want a photograph of people doing something. So let's say it's a chemistry class, and the teacher wants a PowerPoint which includes a photo of people holding test tubes and wearing lab coats. That picture you might go out of your way to find a photo that includes someone who's black, or a woman, or in a wheelchair, or in other words, you're not just sort of grabbing the first photo you come across and putting that up. You are trying to look for photos that meet particular agendas and put them out there so that you can say, well, look, I'm highlighting that Asian people can also be chemists, or that women can work in laboratories, or this issue, that issue. There is a implicit agenda in the choice of photograph, let alone other issues or other elements of teaching. It's not just a photo, it's a photo with an agenda to it. We're also these days expected over the last few years to promote British values, and there's this ongoing discussion which sometimes gets quite heated about what British values are in the first place and what makes them British rather than any other nationality or value, and how teaching staff are engaged in the promotion of that. So this is where we could have a discussion via the chat facility or whatever method you prefer, as to whether you regard this as an enhancement, a positive contribution to the nature of teaching, that these issues should be addressed in the classroom and should be raised, and dodgy comments should be challenged, and diverse imagery should be used, and so forth, British values promoted, or whether you see this as a distraction. Should chemistry teachers focus on teaching chemistry and not on addressing racism and homophobia and what have you? Good thing, bad thing, indifferent thing, a neutral issue? How do you feel about these functions? So is this a form of social engineering, or is it just extending the range of how education deals with a whole raft of subjects in the classroom? Now on to the film. So, Educating Rita, I'm going to make the assumption that you've probably all seen this or seen bits of it and just run with it. So the film version, Michael Caine as the aging alcoholic lecturer, no comments, thank you, and Julie Walters as the mature student from a working class background who is discovering university education for the first time. Something that's perhaps particularly pertinent for West Suffolk College, given that we have lots of mature students, quite a few of whom have been out of education for a very long time and have come back into university education, perhaps never having considered in their past that they might do so. So it's lots of people will be in Rita's position, so it's particularly pertinent for us, more so than maybe for some other educational establishments. So there's this whole dynamic going on, which is both a class dynamic. She's working class, he's middle class. The general atmosphere of the university is upper middle class. I think Frank here, he's more, because of his drinking and so on, he's more sort of sliding down the middle class scale towards unemployment and bankruptcy and what have you. But the broader university culture, because it's one of the old-fashioned, what the Americans like to refer to as Ivy League style universities, rather than a red brick one, the general atmosphere is very upper middle class. And so you've got a working class woman entering into this very upper middle class atmosphere. All of those issues are picked up on and explored in the films, including Rita's husband, Denny, who is very working class and happy to stay working class. Within the film, he wants kids. She doesn't want kids. She wants to focus on her education and kind of breaking out of the monotony of her existence towards what she sees as a much more exciting existence, a more fulfilling, more stimulating existence. Contrasted against that You have Frank, who's already got that existence, and is so bored to death by it, he's drinking himself into an early grave. So what she aspires to, Frank, the lecturer, laughs off as an irrelevance, as not worth having in the first place, as just snobbery and stupidity and so forth. And that's an interesting dynamic. So this isn't just some straightforward Pygmalion-style story of like My Fair Lady taking the flower girl and making her a duchess. This is questioning whether it's worth being made into a duchess in the first place. Is the social elite to which Rita aspires something worth having? Frank thinks it isn't. Denny, her husband, thinks it isn't. He thinks she should be happy with her lot, stay put, get on with it, stop rocking the boat. And if any of you haven't watched the film, spoiler alert, they split up. Rita and Denny, at first somewhat antagonistically, but then they become friends, sort of, in a kind of small scale way. Towards the end of the film, they don't have a romantic reconcilement because Denny finds another woman who does want babies, and he's very happy in that relationship. But they're on friendly terms by the end of the film. So is this a reflection of class differences? People don't tend to value what they have. Frank has it and doesn't value it. Rita has all the things that her husband values, and the woman he eventually marries also values, but she doesn't value them. So she doesn't want what she's got. She wants what Frank's got. Frank doesn't want what he's got. I don't know what Frank wants aside from the bottom of a whiskey bottle. No one's terribly happy in this thing at the start of the film. Reflection of life, perhaps. Is this an envying of male status? Melanie Klein is a psychologist rather than a sociologist, but she argued that Freud had misunderstood the nature of penis envy. So Freud's argument was that women, when they realise that boys, or as I say girls and women, little girls, when they realise boys have penises and they don't, envy those penises and wish they could have one. Melanie Klein says, well, no, not really. What women envy, especially in Freud's lifetime, but even still decades on in Klein's lifetime, what women envy is not the actual bit of flesh, the appendage, but rather the freedom to come and go and do as they please and behave with the same level of freedoms that men, or at least posh men, from Freud's social strata could behave with. And they resented the restrictions being placed upon them. So women didn't want to be restricted and confined, they wanted freedom. And it's an envy of freedom rather than an envy of a particular genital organ. And you could say that there's a strong element of that in this film, that Rita envies the freedoms that she believes will come her way if she gets a university education. And whether she does get those freedoms or not, well, I guess you have to watch the film to fully decide for yourself whether by the end of it she's got what she wants or whether she hasn't got what she wants. When she splits with her husband, she moves in with a rather peculiar woman who is very much part of Frank's sort of social set, very much into the high art books, the highbrow music, very much part of that kind of university cultural set. But such an unstable character that she tries to commit suicide during the film. And in other words, a bit like Frank, someone who's got all the things that Rita is envious of, but is still as miserable as sin, and unhappy with the things that Rita is envious of. So it's not just the freedom Rita's envious of. She's envious of their understanding of classical music, the ease with which they understand highbrow literature and drop literary references into their conversation. She sees this as a sort of wonderful contrast to her gormless husband, Denny, who just blithers on about football and the factory and not much else, and she's bored to death of that. And she sees this middle-class lifestyle as opening up a whole new realm to her. So education is a form of liberation. We could branch out into the theories of Paulo Freire here, who grew up in Central America and moved around South America, teaching and arguing. He was a bit of a Marxist. He was very, very Marxist. He argued, inspired by the liberation theology movement in the Catholic Church, which is also a Central South American phenomenon, or at least it was in Freire's lifetime, that tried to work as much with the very poor as they could, rather than with the middle and upper classes, but to see the message of Christ as applying to the desperately poor, liberating the desperately poor from their poverty. So it was, in other words, liberation theology shouldn't just be about praying and religion, it should also be about physically helping the poor to get out of their poverty. And we are talking about a level of poverty which we no longer have in this country, thankfully. Desperately, desperately poor. So Paulo Freire, who was not particularly religious, said it's not only religion that can liberate, it is education that liberates. So he looked at the desperately poor people in not only his own country but surrounding countries, and said that the key factor of why they are so desperately poor is that they're uneducated. Most of them can't read, most of them can't write, they've got a very limited grasp of maths, they haven't got a hope in hell of ever getting a better paying job, and they don't understand the nature of the corrupt political system that keeps them ground into the dirt. So he dedicated his life to trying to educate people from those communities, teaching them to read and write and so on, but not just to read and write, also to understand the political system in order to see how and why they were being oppressed, with the hope that that would then galvanise them into wanting to do something about that oppression. So he wasn't telling them they had to go out in a revolutionary society. He felt it was sufficient to say, look, you're oppressed and this is how you're oppressed, and then stepping back and waiting for the penny to drop and those people to then decide off their own backs what they wanted to do about that oppression. And so we could say this is the counter, the flip side of what we were saying a minute ago about teachers being tasked to address racism and sexism and all the other isms and British values and so on, of teaching a set of values. Paulo Freire wanted to teach a set of values, but a revolutionary set of values, rather than, let's say, a very liberal middle-class set of values about not being sexist, not being this, not being that. Is that, which is a question of this, is that a middle-class set of values? Do working-class people have those values? Do upper-class people have those values? Or is that a set of values peculiar to the middle classes, that you mustn't indulge in isms and the wish to try and identify an increasingly long list of behaviours and attitudes that can be labelled as being sexist or racist or homophobic or transphobic or some other such term? How do we understand the relationship of those ideas to the class system? Therein is a question in and of itself. So, is gender an issue in education? Now, we can look at it from two angles. We can look at it in terms of the gender of students, which is what we've been touching on to a point so far, but we can also look at it in terms of the gender of teaching staff. So you've got a few stats here, and the source down there that you can go and check if you would like to, government source there. So let's go back to 2015. I don't know if it's necessarily changed a great deal in 5 years. 26% of teachers in England were male. Slightly different patterns in Scotland and Wales and Ireland. 15% of them primary schools, 37% of them secondary schools, 8.5% of teaching assistants were male, the rest were female. So these are heavily female-dominated professions. 74% of teaching staff were female. We hear a great deal these days about drives to get schoolgirls involved in STEM, technological education, and wanting to achieve greater gender balance in the sciences. We don't hear much, in fact I can't remember the last time I did hear anything about a drive to recruit more men to teaching, more males to teaching professions. 74% of teaching staff are female. No one seems to be particularly shocked or outraged at that and think, oh no, we must have a 50-50 split. We must try to increase the number of male teachers to make it equal with the number of female teachers. One of the issues that flags up here is that where you have children from single-parent families where their father might be deceased, or he might have run off and they have very little contact with him perhaps, or if they do have contact with him, he might be an absolutely lovely person, but equally he might be a rather negative role model. Children have a need for positive male as well as for positive female role models in their life, and for some children maybe the only male role model they have that they're in close contact with could be a teacher. That doesn't guarantee, of course, that teacher will be a positive role model and not be a negative one. But the hope for some people is that the more male teachers we have, the more likelihood there will be of positive male role models in the lives of kids, which will then help balance out any potential absence of positive male role models in the children's own home life. So is there a need for more male teaching staff, or does it not make a slightest bit of difference to the impact on children, whether they're taught by a man or whether they're taught by a woman? Does it make any difference to the way they're taught, to the nature of subjects chosen for the curriculum? Would a male teacher choose different subjects from a female teacher if they're looking at a geography class or an English lit class or whatever kind of class might it be? Does the gender of the teacher make a difference? Therein is a potential subject for reflection and possible study and research. If you want to go on to do a master's degree, could that be an issue to examine? Does it matter? 10% white British men from disadvantaged, so very working class and underclass backgrounds go into education. 5 times less likely to go into higher education than white men from very advantaged backgrounds. Is there a push? Often there are drives to get more people from ethnic minority backgrounds into university education. Is there a push to get people from working classes into university education? Should there be? Whether it would be men or women, and whatever ethnicity. To say we need more people from working class backgrounds to go into a university education because it's top heavy with those from very well off backgrounds? Or is this not an issue we are currently addressing in terms of the class structure of students? And of course some of those students will go on to become lecturers in due course, or teachers at primary school, secondary school, whatever level. So this is not only about getting people onto degrees in engineering or physics or what have you, it's also about getting people into degrees who might themselves become teachers and therefore change the demographic of the teaching staff, not only in terms of shifting the demographic around gender, but shifting the demographic around social class. Therein is an issue in itself. Participation rates for black Afro-Caribbean men, 20%, or actually over 20%, white men 10%, for Indian men 50%, people from Chinese and East Asian heritage 60%. So why are white men, much less like white working class men, much less likely to go into university education than, say, Indian or Chinese men from working class backgrounds? There is an issue there that needs to be addressed. Are we going back to this idea of working class lads spending more time establishing their masculinity by being disruptive than by, like the middle class boys, being participative and competitive? How can that be addressed? Is it a cultural, intergenerational cultural issue from the parents? Is it something else again? How do we understand this? Why are we not doing much of anything to address it? Therein is another question. Which brings us, thankfully for my throat, to the end of this particular lecture series. Lots of questions, no answers, the usual. Next week, well, I say next week, it's Easter break next week. So if we are back in class, find a miracle cure and we're all back in class after the Easter holidays, then obviously I'll be delivering this in person. But if the lockdown is continuing, and at the moment no one knows for certain, if the lockdown continues to after the Easter holidays, then obviously this will be another podcasted lecture instead of one in person. But whichever way it is, we're going to have a look at transgender issues and understandings of transgender and how those notions have changed and developed over time in different countries, part of which will include a brief revisit to queer theory and how that relates to the understanding of transgender. And if you could find time, some of you, or actually I know have definitely already watched this because you've told me you've already watched it, but for those of you who haven't seen it, if you could find the time to watch the Danish Girl film, and if you can't get hold of the whole film, at least have a look at some clips on YouTube or whatever, so you can get the gist of the film. It's about one of the very first people, a Danish artist, who transitioned from being a man to being a woman, and had surgery when that surgery was very experimental. So this was very much new ground when this was all taking place. And I won't spoil the end of the film by telling you what happens, because you can watch it for yourself if you haven't already done so, and understand how that film relates to the issues we'll be talking about. So yet again, send me your questions, email or append them to the YouTube or raise them in the chat function on Brightspace. In order to do that, you'll have to let me know that you want me to set up a chat room for you to log messages during a specific day and time slot. But just let me know about that and I'll set something up for you if you'd like to use that facility. And we can discuss these ideas or ideas relating to coursework, what have you. If you haven't already noticed, the problems with access to the module have now all been sorted, and all of you should have easy access to the module now, rather than problems that we've been having in previous weeks. But hopefully you already have noticed that. So I'll end here. Thank you.